The Game Developers Conference is going on right now. It's always a good time to get some juicy, possibly salacious comments from people in the industry.
Of course.
The first GDC I ever worked, I was at a talk, one of the developers on SimCity said out loud to a room full of people, the Wii is a piece of shit. He described it as two GameCubes tied together with
That
duct
was
tape.
that infamous quote.
And I was like, excuse me, I need to go to the press room. Our own Colin Moriarty wrote an article this week. He was at a talk, the narrative lead at Riot Games, makers of League of Legends, and the design lead at Microsoft Game Studios, who were giving a talk on why plot is highly overrated in games. And that players typically do not remember the stories that they experience in games. The thrust of their argument is that developers spend too much time focusing on the third act of their game when most people will never experience it.
That's
Well, it's the survey results, right? Like
Sure.
that people surveyed could recall. You say, "Hey, what was this movie about?" And they could tell you recall the whole plot. "Hey, what was this TV show about?" And they could recall the whole plot. But then in games, "Hey, what was the plot of this game?" And people couldn't tell you in any detail what the plot was.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think, Anthony? After spending a year on the game development side of things, what's your reaction to that?
I would say I'll be very happy if a lot of people were to tell me that they finished. Because I've like talking to people that I've worked with at the studio and stuff too, they tell me that it's very often that people don't usually play like more than like the first hour of something. Whether like they like it or not, it doesn't even matter sometimes. Yeah. It's just like they start trying, they play it for a while, and then they have to move on to something else, and they just never have a chance to come back. I mean, I think it's even indicative of like something like Diablo, which is like obviously a hugely popular game, right? And it's like Blizzard has said publicly that a lot of people never even beat the game on normal. Mm-hmm. It's like that's not even that long of a game. You can get there pretty fast on normal, and it's
and
like
do you have the stats on the completion of games? So there's a survey, and part of it was the recall of plot. No one remembered that, but then another survey question was people that they pulled Steam stats on Steam who finished games.
Yeah. So we have some stats here. I think the stats are a little strange, but we can just go through it here. First of all, I was really surprised to find that only 66% of people finished Walking Dead Season 1, Episode 1. Because that's like...
that's like an hour.
Yeah, that's like 2 hours of a game, and only 66% finished it. On the higher end of things is stuff like Mass Effect 2 and Bioshock Infinite, where people love those stories, but that's still just over 50%, like half the players. Yep. On the low end, like Borderlands 2, Skyrim, Mass Effect 3, these games were just not finished.
Yep.
Now, one thing I think is strange is that these are coming from Steam, and Steam is kind of a different beast from consoles, right? Like you talk about, you have however many hundreds of games on Steam that you never even get to,
now.
right? It's different. Like if you just have a PS4,
I would question.
I feel like you're much more likely to finish that one game that you bought this month.
My one caveat with those stats would be: are those people that started the game, or are those people that own the game? Because I have 500 Steam games, and 300 of them I've never booted up. But if it's people that started the game and didn't finish, then I would consider that pretty legit.
I would be really curious to find out too, like how many people, will like if it was like I'd be curious to know why they didn't finish them. I guess too, like especially something like The Walking Dead, whether it was like they bought it, wasn't all what they expected, and they moved on or something like that. Like
maybe they can connect with characters.
And why I'd also be curious to know like something like Mass Effect 2 and 3, right, where the completion rate was much higher. For me, like even when I think back on it, I don't tend to remember the overarching story of the game as much as I remember little vignettes that were almost like episodes of a
what
TV show.
What happens with Jacob's mission?
Yes,
what happens
exactly.
Jack's
Because that whole game is just vignettes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't like Mass Effect 2
But I'm just saying, like the best parts of the little chunks that are like that, like the mini episodes and those little tiny stories, the sort of macro story is like, I've never been that.
Well, that's what they were talking about in the speech, right? About the fact that like people connect with characters, but not so much as plot.
They connect with characters,
And so that like when you're talking about a game that is 10 hours long, I think it's easier to remember the plot of a 2-hour movie. You're sitting there and watching it, and it's all you're focused on.
That's what I think.
A video game, you run into a wall over and over, trying to get past this boss, this enemy, this room. You finally do. You move on. That room you remember, and you remember this cutscene you like a lot. But we're talking about it on Beyond. The fact that when the story came up. It goes back to, I think, when I argue with people about why I like Uncharted 3 better than Uncharted 2, and people come up with all the time, well, what the hell was what was she going to do with that thing that drove people crazy? And I'm like, I don't even, what does it even fucking matter? Like, I love Nate and Sully's relationship and what they were doing in the gameplay. And yeah, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not hung up on that. But in a movie, it would be, you know, how many times you sit around a movie and talk about how
like if we were watching Uncharted as a movie, like the first Uncharted, right? You'd be like, this is really cliched and stupid and stuff like that. But like at the same time, the dynamic between those two characters is so funny and like good and like charming that it's just like in a game experience, it just works like differently than it does. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Telling a story in a game is hard. Like, if you were writing an Uncharted movie, you wouldn't write a line that was, and then you watch Nate try to get out of a burning building for 10 minutes and he couldn't figure out where to go.
Well, that's the thing. Maybe that's why something like Gone Home works as well as it does, because all they went with is the story. It's a game that, I mean, not that there are obviously video game elements to it. Like, you know, you aren't going to be able to progress through this until you do this and that, right? There's very gamey parts to it, but the game is the story. I mean, so all they do is the story, just like a film does. It is just a story.
Movies are so, like, every single, like, they'll shave seconds in the editing room to make you feel a specific way, and camera angles perfectly tuned to, you know, make you feel tense or make you laugh, like the timing of jokes. And in games, the player's in control. The people that made the game isn't in control. So it's a challenge. Like, you kind of, like, you can have really effective voice acting. You can tell a story through your environment. Like, Irrational is always so good at that.
Yeah.
But it's not the same. Like, I think in many ways, in terms of purely communicating a story, like just a point A to point B story, I feel like in a lot of ways it's an inferior medium to, like, movies where you have complete control over every element of it.
Yeah, and I think, like, again, like, you know, obviously this is, IGN's a place that loves Gone Home. I love Gone Home. But it's like I think one of the things that Gone Home does that's very good is, as far as like being able to tell a story, is that there's no like direct fail condition.
Right.
And so therefore you're never thinking about the fact like, if I mess this up, this choice, or if I don't find this thing in 5 minutes, I'm going to die. Yeah. So it's like you were saying, right? Movies can craft experience where they know, like, right now we want you to feel sad. Gone Home can do that too, because they know that like Uncharted may be trying to do that. They'd be like, man, we really want the player to feel betrayed right now. But for all they know, you're dealing with the fact that you want to break your controller because the last encounter was just awful to you.
It's hard. It's distracting. Like the gameplay, gameplay is everything in a video game, but it does distract from the story. Like, while you're maybe supposed to be thinking about one thing, you're getting shot from this direction, and so your attention is diverted over here. Like, it's just tough. Like,
there's always has to be. I mean, you look at Metal Gear and what a train wreck.
Metal Gear.
The story is, you know, from 1 to 4, and how they have to do it because they want to give you this game that has beautiful bosses and different levels, and this is happening, and how you fight all these different guys. So nobody's fleshed out correctly, and then you got the Lale Lulu.
Yeah. I do like that lack of a failure state is, like, I loved Beyond Two Souls, and I don't feel like anybody else at IGN did.
I liked it.
It was one of my favorite games of last year, and it never even crossed my mind. I got through the whole game before someone's like, yeah, there's no game over. You can't lose. And I'm like, oh. I never even, like, thought about it. I was just so invested in, like, the moment-to-moment, like, you know, her story and what was happening on screen that it didn't even cross my mind that there's no game over.
And that's another game, though, that, like, to me is, like, the overall story is, like, fine, it's whatever. But again, little tiny, like, vignette moments are, like, what makes it so special. Like, I remember particular scenes more than the overall game that were, like, really impactful with me.
So just looking at the quote, plot is highly overrated in games, I'm tempted to agree with that, actually. I don't, if a game tells me a great story, I appreciate that. I think it's great. I was moved by the end of Half-Life 2, Episode 2.
Oh, yeah.
But when I sit down to play a video game, I'm not thinking I'm sitting down to get a good story. I'm sitting down to have fun playing a game.
The story's an excuse to take you from, like, set piece to set piece.
I mean, like, for instance, Titanfall, right? Titanfall has a campaign, and it's like, it's like they insert story things over the multiplayer gameplay and stuff, but like, I play it and I don't care about any of that, because all I care about is that I'm having a fun dropping gigantic awesome robots on things and shooting things.
But for the most
friends.
part, doesn't it come down to what you want in that moment, and that's what video games get to offer because they're so diverse? Like, I always say that I'm a story whore. Like, I love story in my games, and I'm one of the people who love plot, and like Infamous Second Son's up now, and like, one of the things in there is like the story's not great, and like some kid came at me on Twitter, even though I didn't review it, is like, this is the problem with critics. You all care so much about story, and none of us do. And I'm like, well, we say the gameplay is fun, but like, I do want a great story in this kind of game. Whereas a movie or a book, it's all about. I mean, I guess there's idiots like Alex Solomita are like, man, Transformers, there's this awesome explosion, I got a beard. But for the most part, like, you go to a movie expecting a good story, so clearly you're more invested in the plot there.
Also, that kid shouldn't speak for everyone. There are plenty of people that I see on comments all the time that are like, a story is what matter to me more than anything.
Right.
I think the devil's advocate argument would be, Like the question is it like which comes first? Like, do people not recall stories because the stories just aren't that great? Like, you know, if you're a really, really talented story maker, maybe you're writing a book or maybe you're writing screenplays and not writing games.
Yeah.
And that's totally unfair to like all the people that are writing stories and games. But like, it does beg the question, right? Like, a lot of game stories are just like Space Marine junk. Like, you know, it's an excuse for the gameplay, and it's an excuse to shoot the guns, and like that's where the emphasis is.
Right.
I mean, I think there's also a difference too. Is like when a movie's made, a director has a vision, and they're often able to see it through, right? And they're not necessarily limited by a lot of technological things, depending on the type of movie they're making. Whereas in games, like I know that like, so you'll sit down with the person that wrote this awesome story, and they'll be like, "Man, this is what I wrote," and you'll be like, you'll approach it, and you'll come to it, and you'll be like, "That's going to be a 12-minute cutscene, which is going to cost a ton of money. We can't do that. Just no time." All right, so what if we just turn that into audio logs?
Right.
And then that's what ends up happening. So there was like a cool story that might have made this game like intensely emotional, but time and budget just cut it out, and so it became something that only like 1/100th of the audience is going to get to see.
You're serving a lot more masters when you're making a game instead of just like the story master. Master! But it's like gameplay's first in most games, right? And so that just means by definition the story's going to take a back seat.
Sure.